Did humanity really walk on the moon, or was it maybe the greatest show ever put on Earth? I mean, it's a question that still, even now, sparks just incredible debate. And today on the deep dive, that's exactly what we're getting into.
Yeah, and for this deep dive, we've got a really fascinating setup. We're looking at a transcribed discussion between two AIs. First up is Apollo. Think of it as a NASA scientist AI, representing all the evidence, the proof for the lunar landings being real.
Okay, and facing off against Apollo, we have Skeptic, an AI basically programmed to argue the other side all the key points and alternative ideas from the conspiracy theorists. So it's like a direct AI debate.
Exactly. Set up to give you the critical arguments, sort of the core points from both perspectives.
Right. And our mission for you, the listener, today is really to walk through this AI chat, pull out the big takeaways. We want to give you a clear picture of the main arguments without, getting totally lost in every single tiny detail.
Uh-huh. So by the end, you should have a pretty solid grasp of what this whole debate really boils down to.
Okay, let's dive in then. Apollo kicks things off, laying out the case for the moon landing. What were the main things it brought up?
Well, Apollo comes out strong with a whole range of evidence. There's the telemetry data that's basically the spacecraft's measurements and signals back to Earth, then mission logs, all those photos and videos we've seen, the actual moon rock samples, and critically, the fact that Apollo 11 wasn't just tracked by NASA, it was tracked independently all over the world, even, crucially, by the Soviet Union.
Right, the Soviets. That's a big point.
Yeah, and Apollo's main argument kind of hinges on this idea of scale. Like, the sheer complexity of the actual mission was immense, playing off a fake that convincing. Apollo argues that might have been even harder, an even more colossal task.
Okay, but then Skeptic immediately jumps in with some of those classic counter-arguments we hear all the time, like the missing original moonwalk tapes, right? That's always a big one.
Definitely. That and the picture of the flag waving when there's supposed to be no air. Also, why aren't there any stars in the photos? And the really big question, could 1960s tech actually shield astronauts from all that deep space radiation?
So Skeptic kind of flips Apollo's massive operation idea on its head.
Exactly. Skeptic counters with, well, what if it was just a massive production, like a movie set, basically? It challenges the transparency and the tech capability claims right off the bat.
Let's focus on that waving flag for a second, because honestly, it's such a sticky image for people who have doubts. What's Apollo's explanation?
So Apollo points out, look, there's no wind on the moon, obviously.
Yeah.
So the flag wasn't waving in a breeze. The engineers actually put a horizontal rod through a hem at the top of the flag just to make it hang straight out, look unfurled for the pictures.
Okay, so it wasn't flapping.
No. Any ripples or apparent movement you see, that's just from when the astronauts were setting it up, wrestling the pole into the ground. Just momentum. It's a really good example of how, our everyday experience here on Earth, seeing flags wave in the wind, makes us interpret that image incorrectly in a totally alien environment.
That's a really good point about our Earth-based assumptions. Okay, what about the missing stars? That seems like something you definitely expect to see from the moon.
Apollo's answer there is all about camera settings. Basically, the lunar surface is incredibly bright, right?
Oh, okay.
And so are the astronauts in their white suits under direct sunlight. To get a good picture of them, the cameras had to be set with a fast shutter speed and a small aperture. Short exposure.
Okay.
Stars are really faint points of light. To capture them, you'd need a much longer exposure. So the cameras were simply set up for the main subject, the bright moon surface, and the astronauts. The stars were too dim to show up under those settings.
It's a photography thing, essentially. Makes sense.
Yeah, it kind of highlights how what you don't see in a photo can sometimes tell you as much about how it was taken as what you do see.
Right. Now, the radiation, that always felt like a really serious hurdle for the 60s tech. How did they deal with that?
Apollo makes a couple of key points here. First, the most intense radiation zones, the Van Allen belts, they actually passed through them relatively quickly. The trajectory was planned to minimize the time spent in the worst parts, so the total dose wasn't as high as you might think.
Okay, so a quick transit.
And second, the astronauts actually carried dosimeters devices that measure radiation exposure. Apollo cites that data, saying it showed the exposure was within what they considered acceptable limits for the mission. It also briefly mentions the current Artemis program, kind of as a nod to say, look, we can handle this now, and we can handle it then, building on that knowledge.
Okay. Then, as Skeptic brings up a question I think a lot of us have probably wondered. If we went then, why haven't we really gone back? Set up a base or something?
Yeah, that's a common one. Apollo's response really boils down to shifting priorities and, frankly, budget cuts. After the initial Apollo program achieved its Cold War goal, the political will, the public interest, and crucially, the funding all shifted. Space exploration moved towards things like the space shuttle, the ISS, robotic probes. It wasn't that we couldn't go back, technically. It's that the focus changed.
So politics and money, basically.
Pretty much.
Critics?
It's a good reminder how much those factors influence even massive scientific projects.
Okay, and what about those weird shadows in some photos, the ones that don't look parallel?
Right, as Skeptic points those out as looking unnatural, maybe like studio lighting. Apollo explains it's mostly down to two things. First, the lunar surface isn't flat. It's bumpy, uneven, with craters and hills. On an uneven surface, shadows from a single distant light source the sun can appear to converge or diverge because of perspective.
Ah, like looking down a long, bumpy road.
Sort of, yeah. And the second factor is the wide-angle lenses they use on the Hasselblad cameras. Wide-angle lenses can distort perspectives, especially near the edges of the frame. Combine that with the lack of atmosphere, no haze to help judge distance like here on Earth, and shadows can look a bit strange to our eyes.
Interesting. What about the live TV feed? Skeptic seemed skeptical about transmitting video all the way from the moon in 1969.
Apollo clarifies that, well, we shouldn't think of it like the HD streaming we have today. It wasn't that at all. It was a specially developed, low bandwidth, kind of slow scan analog TV signal, engineered specifically for that long distance transmission. It needed a network of huge radio dishes back on Earth to pick it up. Think more like early fuzzy television broadcasts, not crystal clear video. The goal was just to get an image back.
Okay, so achievable, just not high def.
Exactly. Optimized for the task with the tech they had.
Gotcha. Now, Skeptic pivots a bit here towards the issue of trust, questioning NASA's credibility, mentioning those lost original tapes again, and how quiet someone like Neil Armstrong was later in life.
Right. Skeptic taps into that general skepticism some people have towards big institutions. The fact that NASA admitted some original telemetry tapes were reused, wiped, and recorded over, which was apparently standard practice then because tape was expensive and bulky.
Oh, really? Standard practice.
According to Apollo, yeah.
Yeah.
But skeptics sees that loss of data as suspicious. And they also interpret, say, Armstrong's desire for privacy later in life as potentially hiding something.
How does Apollo respond to that?
Apollo basically says, well, judging someone's character or motives based on how much they seek the limelight isn't really evidence for or against the landing itself. And it reiterates that, well, yes, some lower quality telemetry tapes were overwritten. Copies of the actual broadcast footage definitely exist. But the crucial point Apollo brings up again here is the independent tracking, especially by the Soviets.
Yeah, that seems hard to argue with. If it was faked, you'd think the Soviets would have shouted it from the rooftops.
Precisely. They had the motive and the means to detect a hoax. Their silence, and indeed their tracking data confirming the mission, is pretty powerful evidence according to Apollo.
It really is. But Skeptic doesn't stop there, does it? It gets into even deeper conspiracy territory, suggesting maybe the Soviets were in on it, a staged draw in the space race.
Yeah, Skeptic throws that out there as a possibility, a kind of geopolitical agreement to fake it for mutual benefit, maybe ease Cold War tensions. Very speculative. And then it brings up the really famous one, the Stanley Kubrick connection, the idea that the director of 2001, A Space Odyssey, was hired to film the whole thing in a studio.
Yes, the Kubrick theory always pops up.
It does. Apollo pretty firmly dismisses it, though. Says there's absolutely zero credible evidence linking Kubrick to it. Points out that the look and feel of the Apollo footage is totally different from Kubrick's meticulous style. And more importantly, the technology in 1969 just wasn't there to convincingly fake things like the low-gravity movement, the unique lighting, the physics of the dust being kicked up. Not on that scale, anyway. Plus, the number of people who'd have to keep that secret.
Yeah, the scale of the conspiracy itself becomes unbelievable.
That's Apollo's point.
Okay, what about the lunar module taking off from the moon? Skeptic questions the lack of a visible flame.
Right. Apollo explains this is because the ascent stage used hypergolic propellants. These are fuels that ignite spontaneously just on contact with each other, no spark needed. And the specific chemicals used, Aerozine-50 and nitrogen tetroxide, burn very efficiently with a flame that's largely transparent or invisible in a vacuum.
Ah, okay. So there was thrust, just not a big fiery plume like we see with, say, the Saturn V launch.
Exactly. And as for how that ascent was filmed, Apollo says there was a camera mounted on the lunar rover, which was left behind. It was controlled remotely from mission control back in Houston. They panned and tilted it to track the ascent module lifting off. Apollo makes a neat point here. Sometimes the very precision and careful planning involved in the real mission gets misinterpreted by skeptics as evidence of staging, because it seems too perfect.
That's an interesting twist. Okay, S skeptic also brings up some specific photo oddities, right? Like crosshairs appearing behind objects.
Yeah, and backgrounds looking identical in photos taken miles apart, apparently.
Yeah.
And that famous rock with what looks like a letter C marked on it.
Right, the prop rock.
Apollo tackles these one by one. The crosshairs, those little plus marks on the photos, they were etched onto a glass plate inside the camera called the Rousseau plate. Sometimes, if a really bright object in the photo got overexposed, the white glare could blow out the thin black line of the crosshairs, making it look like the object is in front of it. Simple photographic effect.
Okay, overexposure. What about the identical backgrounds?
That's down to the lack of atmosphere again. On the moon, there's no air, no haze, no humidity to scatter light or make distant things look fuzzy or blue. So, distant mountains, even miles away, can look incredibly sharp and clear, almost like they're right there. Without those familiar atmospheric cues, judging distance and scale is really hard, and backgrounds can appear deceptively similar, even if the camera moved quite a bit.
Makes sense. And the sea rock?
Apollo dismisses that as a long-debunked internet myth. Says it's most likely just a stray hair or a fiber that got onto the negative or print during processing or scanning later on. It doesn't appear on the original film. Apollo kind of emphasizes how these easily explained things just keep circulating online as proof.
It is fascinating how sticky some of these arguments are. Despite the explanations, Skeptic even mentions that belief in the hoax seems to be growing, arguing that skepticism towards big institutions is important.
Yeah, Skeptic definitely plays that card, the value of questioning authority, the idea that maybe we shouldn't just blindly trust official narratives. Apollo counters by saying, look, science welcomes questioning, it thrives on critical thinking, but ultimately it demands evidence. Verifiable, testable evidence. And it points back to things like the laser retroreflectors left on the moon. Scientists today, right now, bounce lasers off those mirrors to measure the Earth-Moon distance with incredible precision. That's ongoing, physical proof.
And the moon rocks themselves.
Exactly. Studied by scientists worldwide, completely independent labs, all confirming they have unique isotopic signatures, ages, and compositions, totally unlike Earth rocks, but matching meteorites believed to be lunar. Apollo stresses these aren't matters of faith in NASA. They're about physical reality you can check.
So as this AI debate wraps up, the core difference in how they approach the whole thing really stands out, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Skeptics' bottom line is rooted in this fundamental distrust. It demands some kind of impossible, unfiltered, perfect proof. It suggests if one thing might be questionable, maybe everything is. Believing becomes an act of faith in the system, as Skeptic puts it.
Whereas Apollo
Finishes by contrasting that deep-seated doubt with the scientific method itself relying on physical evidence, on things you can test and verify independently. It stands by the data, the samples, the independent tracking, and basically concludes the evidence overwhelmingly supports the reality of Apollo. The footprints are still up there.
Wow. Okay, so we've really covered the ground here, going through this AI clash of perspectives on the moon landing. You've heard Apollo lay out the mountains of evidence and Skeptic persistently chipping away with questions about anomalies, trust, and technology.
Yeah, and some of the key takeaways for you listening might be things like, the simple mechanical reason for the flag appearing to wave, or the camera settings explaining the lack of stars. I mean, even that point about the moon rocks being studied globally for decades, that's pretty solid ongoing verification, isn't it?
It really is. Okay, so here's a final thought for you to chew on. Thinking about all these arguments, both sides, what kind of evidence would actually settle a question like this for good in your mind? And maybe more fundamentally, how do you balance healthy skepticism with, the sheer weight of scientific consensus when faced with extraordinary claims?
Yeah, it's a fascinating place where science, belief, trust, and just our own perception of reality all kind of collide. Definitely something to think about.